Hello and welcome to the School Governance Network. Today we have a very special episode with you. As usual, I'm joined by Paul, but we also have a special guest, Leila Holmyard. And I'm quite excited to be introducing Leila because it was about 9 months ago that I first got in contact with her when she was doing research for her PhD. And one of the topics that that we're going to be talking about today when we talk about board structures was really the focus of our interview together. And when she finished her thesis, or dissertation, I was really excited to get a copy of it and start to read through it, which really prompted and sparked this collaboration with Leila to do this webinar, because I'll be honest with you, a lot of boards that I've met with this year and last year have really been struggling with what is the optimal board structure. They're really trying to juggle this different demand for teacher representatives, bringing alumni onto the board, the difference between self-perpetuating and parent-elected boards where there's regular turnover. And what I hope to really get from today, not only myself to be able to go deeper into the work that Leila's done, but for you, our audience, to really have a good foundation to make some very important decisions that I know that you're all struggling with. With that said, I want to jump right into it and give Leila an opportunity to introduce herself. So Leila, please.
Okay, so my name is Leila Holmyard. I'm currently based in Germany and I'm a biology teacher originally. I've previously taught in Saudi Arabia and Vietnam. At the moment, I'm a stay-at-home mum to my two little girls, Holly and Heather. You can see some photos of them there. And I keep my hand in kind of during my parental leave by working on my master's degree, consulting for ManageBack, which is a learning management system, and being a workshop leader and a site visitor for the IB. So I'm here today to talk about the research that I'm conducting for my dissertation for my master's degree in educational leadership and management. And I'm doing that with the University of Bath. I looked at the nature of the hybrid model for governance, which includes having both elected and self-perpetuating board members, and that was specifically within the international school context. So before I talk about my research, I was going to give a little bit of background on the international school context. So the number of international schools is really growing at the moment. It's estimated that nearly 5 million students are in international schools. In the past, so historically, international schools have generally been not-for-profit institutions, but over time, there's a shift in the landscape of international schools, and now it says over 80% of students are currently in for-profit international schools. So it's a real change, especially over the last kind of 15 years. And if you want more information on what the international school sector looks like now, the ICS research that was released last year gives a really good overview of what the international school context is like at the moment. Another big change has been the growth of corporate brands of schools as well. So with no international body with the authority to set standards for international schools, any school can call themselves international. And that brings some challenges. Even using a simple definition like the provision of an international curriculum is quite complicated because many national systems now use international curricula like the IB. So the question of what is an international school is really quite complex. And the diversity of cultural context really complicates matters. And with regard to governance, some schools have to meet specific national requirements as well. Nevertheless, despite all these challenges, there is substantial opportunity in the international school sector as well for governance. Most schools are relatively free of government requirements in terms of their governance structure, so they have the freedom to explore structures that state schools may not be able to. And I'm hoping that my research will provide international schools with the impetus to kind of embrace this unique opportunity that they have to be innovative in their approach to governance. I don't know if you want to jump in here, Paul or Michael, with anything about the general context of international schools as your experience.
No, I think you're doing a great job really kind of setting the tone for really the dilemma that school boards face, especially and particularly the growth of the for-profit or the branded school. So that's really great information.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit before I go into my research about what research has already been done. So there really hasn't been that much research done on international school governance yet, but one of the most comprehensive studies to date was done in 2014 by Professor Chris James and his colleagues at the University of Bath. And Professor James was actually my tutor for this dissertation, so he was really helpful for guiding me through the research process, and I've been able to use some of his expertise during my study. So Professor James's study looked at the governance models used by different types of international schools and what the pros and cons were of each. And they found that for-profit, privately owned international schools tended towards self-perpetuating boards in which board members appointed their replacements. And this self-perpetuating model was found to offer more financial stability and long-term sustainability. And this supports a skills-based approach to governance in which board members are appointed specifically due to the expertise that they can bring to the board. But the disadvantages of this model were that these boards are more likely to become set in their ways. They're also more likely to be dragged into the micromanagement of the school and maybe reluctant to take risks as well. And when asked, heads of school said that the self-perpetuating model tended to lack transparency and lack stakeholder voice as well. So then in contrast, international schools that were run as not-for-profits tended to be run as foundations or trusts, for example, and these tended to have elected boards. So the positive of these was that they promote a democratic approach to governance because the stakeholders tend to be directly represented on the board. In the international school setting, it's usually parents being represented, sometimes faculty, not very often students directly represented on the board. So this model was positive because of the stakeholder voice, but it was criticised for lacking strategic oversight and long-term planning, and for having a high turnover of board members and also a high turnover of heads as well. So James and Shepherd, at the end of their research, they suggest that a hybrid which mixes the elected and the self-perpetuating board may offset the disadvantages of each. And this was what my dissertation was based on. I wanted to explore whether that is true, whether this hybrid mix of the two models was the optimum for international schools.
Leila, can I just jump in with a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
That absolutely fascinating research that they've done. Did they give any reasons for why there was a lack of strategic oversight? Did you mention the sort of high turnover? Was that one of the key reasons for no strategic oversight, or did they have other reasons why? Or they just noticed
I think
there was none?
Well, elected boards tend to be made up of parents, so I think maybe the lack of strategic oversight is linked to parents being very currently invested in the school, rather than thinking necessarily about 5 years in the future when their own children have left.
Yeah.
And if I could just ask one question too, when you looked at the elected board structures, was there like an average for the number of years or in terms of the turnover of the board?
I can't remember any facts and figures on that, but I do remember that the elected boards tended to have shorter tenures as board members. I think when I was talking to the experts, I think the optimum, they said, for a board member was kind of the 3 to 5 year range. And that if you had a tenure that was any longer than that, it tended to be too long to have someone on the board without the opportunity to look at replacing them. And I'll talk about it a little bit later about my case study school. They have a two-year tenure, and that was considered to be too short. That was one of the criticisms about the model I looked at. Okay, so this slide was just to direct you to a few references that cover everything that I said previously. So this bottom one is the James and Shepherd study that ISC research, and then this book, this is a chapter by Mary Hayden and Jeff Thompson, that talk about the international school context generally. So that's just some further reading. I'm happy to share my dissertation with you, which goes into all of that in much more detail as well.
Yeah, we can definitely link that to the video.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the research that I did. So I'll go through what the data was that I collected, what my key findings were, and then what recommendations I was able to make as a result of it. Okay, so this is my, sorry, I'm just checking. So yes, my dissertation was an exploratory case study of an international school in Western Europe. So this is a well-established not-for-profit school that serves globally mobile families in the local area. The board comprises 6 elected and 5 appointed board members, and there's also 1 faculty board member as well, who is elected by the employees of the school. So I collected data in these 3 ways. So I carried out interviews with school leaders and board members from the case study school, and also observed committee meetings and board meetings over a 7-month period. So during the meetings, I took notes about the verbal interactions of all the people in the meetings and then classified them. So for example, when they were making a contribution in the meeting, I was making a note of it and then saying whether it was related to, say, long-term strategic planning, whether it was a comment about their own personal experience, whether they were information gathering, or whether they were providing a fact that contributed to the meeting. So I was classifying their contributions in that way, with a view to determining how the different people in those meetings were contributing differently. So maybe trying to find a difference between the faculty board member and the appointed board members and the elected board members in the way that they conduct themselves in meetings. So then to triangulate the data, I had Skype interviews with 9 experts in international education. And these were people who were current or former heads or board members of international schools, people like Michael that provide consultancy for international schools, specifically in governance, and then people who were kind of on the board of accrediting or international school bodies. And so this use of multiple data sets added validity to the research. And bringing in the expert views allowed me to kind of look beyond the context of my case study school and make generalizations for international education in general. Okay, so next I'll just talk a little bit about the data that I collected. So this was the observation data, and there's loads here, so I'll just try and pick out a few interesting points. So if you look at the first 2 columns, these compare the interactions in meetings of appointed board members and elected board members, and the different colours represent the different types of interaction. So if you look at the bottom blue section of each column, you can see the blue is larger for appointed board members than for elected board members. And this was for interactions, so comments or feedback that they were giving, that was based specifically on the professional skills that they bring to the board. And you can see it's larger for appointed board members. And so this evidence supports that idea I mentioned earlier, that appointed board members provide expertise, skills-based expertise to the board. So then another example is the long-term strategy, which is the orange section kind of in the middle. And you can see that the elected board members actually provided more comments to do with long-term strategy than any other group. And this was a direct contradiction to the literature. So that was really interesting to explore. So I had to look at the interview data to try and work out why is it that the literature tells us that elected board members are more focused maybe on short-term issues than long-term strategy. But my research was saying that the elected board members were heavily focused on long-term strategy. And what came out of the interviews was the huge value that the school places on screening before elections. So actually talking to potential candidates and finding out their reasons for wanting to put themselves forward, and also sharing the role, like what the governance role really is at this school, and also then the training that they get once they're elected. And it seemed to me, from looking at these two data sets together, that the training and the screening was really, really important for avoiding those elected board members potentially being pulled into the short-term, the trap of looking at short-term issues all the time. And then there's some more support for this idea as well from the final column on the right. So PM there is parent members, so parents who were invited to attend board meetings or committee meetings but hadn't undergone any training. And you can see that they focus less on long-term strategy. And the red column, which is actually biggest for that group of PM, is the personal experiences. So the people who were not trained brought a lot more of their own personal ideas into meetings. So for example, well, my child experienced this, or when I was at school, it was like this. So that again provides evidence for the training, because the only difference between those two columns is that the elected board members were parents who had been elected, gone through the screening process, and had been trained according to what the school's requirements were for board members. So I don't know if you want to maybe just take a look at the faculty board member, because that's a really interesting one. So the faculty board member is the third column in from the left. And this role was pretty controversial. So roughly half the experts spoke in favour of having a faculty board member and half were against it. And I can't remember, Michael, can you remember where you came down? No, we might have lost Michael briefly, but
does look like we've lost him, or he's just blown away by what the data.
Well, okay. So the faculty board member is one that is pretty controversial, whether there should be one or not. But interestingly, the case study school was unequivocal. They absolutely were in favour of having a board member who was a member of the faculty. And so one of the reasons for this, I think, is that huge blue section at the bottom for the faculty board member column, because the faculty board member was bringing their professional experience as a teacher of the school into board meetings, bringing something that the other board members didn't have, which is the kind of on-the-ground knowledge. And I wanted to share with you just one anecdote that the faculty board member told me, which really illustrates the value of the role. So he explained that the school had been undergoing construction for several years, and the board was discussing what to do next. So what was the next project going to be? And he said that actually there are some students and teachers in this school who have never known what it's like to have a quiet school, and that construction noise had been continually present the whole time they'd been at the school. And from this, the conversation turned to construction fatigue, and the other board members realised that this could be an issue and that they hadn't really noticed it because they only came in and out of the school as needed for board meetings. And they decided that they would actually take a break from the construction. And I think that's a real example of the power of having someone who's kind of on the ground in school in those meetings to be able to speak about their own experiences of working in the school.
I'm finding this fascinating. So most of my work, Leila, is outside the school space in the corporate and charitable space. And also I'm finding what's really interesting is the parallels that you've got here with that and in Australia and New Zealand superannuation boards. So that's sort of pension funds who have membership. And again, most of those boards have a mixture of appointed and elected board members in the same structure, but they also have that sort of expertise who represents the members. So again, their experiential side of things of actually being a customer. They also have the employee reps as well. Again, so those two major stakeholders. So that's really interesting. And I think what I'm loving about these examples you've given us here is just how much thought and care has gone into this composition of the board. They've gone really deep into it, and it tells with this data as well. Sorry to interrupt.
No, of course. So I'll leave that there, but if you are interested, I mean, this is in my dissertation in a lot more detail and breaking down all the different sections. Okay, so this is, I'm going to talk a little bit now about this.
Sorry, just quickly, was SL student liaison, just as it out of interest?
School leaders.
School leaders, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and then and the other one is faculty and staff. So like for this one, you can see the one for the faculty and staff, you can see it's the largest on the pink because they were providing facts and figures. So their role wasn't really to ask questions or look at long-term strategic planning, which is why like the orange is so small, but they were there providing information to the board when the board was asking questions of them.
Perfect.
Okay, so from my interview data, these were the themes that emerged as being, I guess, that was talked about the most as being valuable. So the structure of the board, representation of stakeholders, the disposition and capability and motivation of board members, their understanding of the governor role, which then helped them fulfill it, and the relationship between the board and the school leadership. So I thought, since this is about board structure, I'd just look at board structure in detail there by offering some examples of what people said about board structure. So this is the expert feedback. I just picked out some different quotes that came up. So the experts were fairly mixed in terms of structure. So some of them said that structure doesn't really matter. And this is the first quote: if you find the right people who understand the role, the way they get there doesn't matter. So her point there was that whether you're elected or you're appointed, it's about the training that they receive is most important. And then we got quite a lot of conflict between the experts in terms of whether elected or self-perpetuating was better. And you can see, so one expert has said the greater degree of election, the better. And then on the other hand, the third quote there is saying parent power drives decision-making if you have an elected board. And then other people made the point about the expertise that's needed on the board. If you have a fully elected board, you can actually miss out on having the necessary skills for running the board, so that you could end up with a board with no one with any financial skills. And then finally, they were generally in favour of the hybrid model. And this is the bottom quote illustrated that, in that self-perpetuating members, so your appointed board members, can give continuity, understanding and history, whereas having the elections allows the board to stay current, so you have new ideas, new blood coming in, and you also facilitate that representation, so provided a good balance. So then what school leaders said was they really like the hybrid model because they think it provides a check and balance on the board. So that they thought that it was really important that the parents, being stakeholders, were able to have that sense of ownership about having the elections. And the third quote there was an interesting one, because one of the school leaders said that they wanted to have more female representation on the board, and also they wanted to have someone from a STEM background on the board. And then they managed to find a parent who actually met both of those criteria, so then they were able to ask her to join the board as an appointed member. And because of the role that she has, she would never have run for the board. Like she has a high position and is very busy. But the fact that they were able to ask her to join meant that she did make the time for it. So the school felt quite lucky that they were able to get her. And if it was a fully elected board, that they wouldn't have been able to have her. And actually, there was a couple of other quotes that from school leaders kind of saying, if you knew what this person did for their job, you would know that they would never have run for election because they were so busy. But the fact that they're asked raises it in their awareness. So they were able to access those skills. And there was kind of one point at the bottom here, which is quite interesting, about the elected board members, which was talking about how new elected board members might be slightly agenda driven, but once they're inducted onto the board and they take part in the training process, to the kind of the culture of governance at the school, that kind of mitigated against any potential issues. And then finally, the board members again spoke really positively about the hybrid model, saying that like the appointed board members give continuity, but also it doesn't stagnate. There's that new blood coming in all the time through the elections. Although one of the things that came up at the case study school was this 2-year tenure being quite short. So you could have a board member be elected in, and by the time they're kind of settled into their role, somebody else could be elected in their place, and then they have to start the whole process again. So one of my recommendations to the school was actually maybe to think about lengthening the term to 3 years. But they were worried that people wouldn't be able to commit to that long. So I think it's kind of they have to kind of make a judgment on that. And the bottom quote there just talks about the screening being a really important aspect of their appointment process. So both appointed and elected board members went through a screening process where a committee was set up to talk to people who were interested in running for the board, or to approach people to be appointed, to check that they have the right competencies, the right motivation for joining the board, that they're not driven by a single agenda, for example. Okay, so that was kind of a summary of one of the aspects of my study, but of course all of those other themes, I write in more detail about them in my study.
No, thanks for going deep into the board structure though, because I mean, that's really at the heart of, I think, of a lot of issues that boards are having. And that anecdotal information, I think, should help provide some really good guidance in terms of where they need to be looking. And I know one of the things that Paul's really going to be excited.
I'm not sure what I'm going to be excited about. He's lost it. Again. I might actually quickly ask a question about representation that my new Michael was going to ask.
Yeah.
A lot of boards that he's working with are struggling with the questions such as, should they have a teacher representation on the board? You know, we're talking about parents, elected parent board directors. What about teacher representatives? Or even at the other end of the spectrum, special appointees with absolutely no relationship with the school. You know, were you able to build consensus or any idea of what the optimal structure may look like and who should be involved during the research?
Yeah, well, I think schools are generally quite fearful of having a faculty board member. But I don't see really the faculty board member as any different in terms of risk as having an elected parents on the board, because you can have a parent or a faculty member that comes in that's highly agenda driven. They might be obstructive, they might be short-sighted, and all those things that we worry about. They might be indiscreet. So I think it's about having structures in place within your kind of articles of association and the way that you run the board, that you have safeguards in place for if anybody is inappropriate, what steps can be taken by the chair and the rest of the board. So I think that there's always a risk when you have elections, but I think having the screening process is really valuable in really articulating what the role is. And then having the whole board go through training together where they're looking at what their norms are and what the expectations are of board members is really valuable. You know, something to maybe to happen every summer, that the board comes together and reiterates like what those norms are and how they're going to work together in the interest of the school. And I think it's worth pointing out actually that nobody going onto the board should think that they represent a particular group anyway. So the faculty, even though they're elected, a faculty member may be elected by the teachers and the employees of the school, once they join the board, they're an equal custodian of the school. So they're there to speak for their personal experience, but they're not there to speak for the faculty, in the sense that they're not pushing an agenda from the faculty. They're looking at every decision on what is in the best interest of the school, not what's in the best interest of the faculty. And I think that comes through in the training.
And I think you're right. Like it's so important, as you say. You know, this diversity of board structure is fantastic, but without the right processes and protocols in place to ensure you have the right people sitting at the right table, you're going to really struggle with that board culture. And you do see a lot of organisations, schools, and otherwise, especially volunteer-led ones, non-profits, who, you know, they say this is what we mean. They go for the first person who puts their hand up without any process in place, and that's what leads to a ineffective or less effective boardroom. And I think you put together a fantastic argument for why we need not just a really well-structured board, but the processes of inducting those people, but screening them. One of the things we've talked about in previous webinars is how to recruit a board in general. And one of the things we've introduced is a filter to actually, because a lot of schools say they struggle to attract the right candidates for the board. The problem is they don't actually do the communication properly up front. So we actually created this questionnaire, simple, like 10-question questionnaire, which actually acts as a sort of pre-interview filter or pre-application filter. Because if they answer it in a certain way, they're going to be asked to apply or not apply. But it also allows the person completing the questionnaire to understand really what's being asked of them. And again, the ones who are not used to governance are probably not going to know that without training. So again, you create a stronger filter, but it's also for the actual potential candidate, instead of going, you know what, I have to invest hours of my life in applying for this role, or at least putting myself forward to be elected, I could just spend 10 minutes filling in a survey to see if it's the right thing for me. So it actually allows a greater flow of people coming through who may have been scared off by the potential application process as well. So this is all great, because it's what you're talking about and is really dovetailing nicely into what we've actually previously talked about on previous webinars, which is, so it's great. It's great reinforcement of your thinking and our thinking.
Fantastic. Well, at least we're aligning on that. So yeah, I think the screening is one of the most important things. I think there's a concern really that having the screening process somehow impedes on the democratic participation element. But for me, it is really important. It really comes through from the experts and from the school how important it is to have that screening process. So I definitely agree with what you were talking about having some kind of filter. So I'll just run quickly through the key findings from my research, and then I'll talk about a model which I created to help schools with using the hybrid structure. So the first was that the hybrid board does in fact capture the advantages of both election and appointment. So the elections facilitate the transparency, stakeholder representation, engagement with the community, whereas having the appointment side allows targeted recruitment so that you can get specific skills or specific attributes, and allow for the maintenance of institutional memory as well. What was less clear was about whether the hybrid structure buffered against the disadvantages. It seems that it does, but my instinct here is that it's the screening and the training that is perhaps more important at mitigating against the disadvantages. So avoiding kind of focus on the short term, being very reactive. The kind of proactive nature of the board, I think, is really well supported by the training process and the induction process. So then the third thing was that in terms of representation, some of the experts and some of the school leaders and board members felt that direct representation was really important. But I think that one thing that came through from my study, especially the observations, was that the appointed board members advocated for stakeholders just as much as the elected board members. So you can have an appointed board or appointed board members who can advocate successfully for stakeholders. So it doesn't necessarily have to be direct representation, but again, it comes back to the training process, making sure that all board members know that they're a custodian of the whole school, not representing specific groups. And then finally, this comes back to what you're saying, which is recruitment and training is key. So making sure that governors or board members have the desirable skills and motivations, making sure that they understand their role, establishing protocols and policies to guide their actions. And these things together all promote positive relationships between the school leaders and the board members themselves, and help the whole board and the school leadership focus on the long-term strategic planning that's necessary for a successful board. So this is taken straight out of my document, so it's a little bit fuzzy, but this is a model that I put together for how a school could use hybrid governance, and it's in two parts. So I'll just talk through the beginning. So it's saying that before doing anything in terms of recruitment, boards should take some kind of audit to identify gaps in their collective capabilities. And then from that audit, they can then do specific headhunting, or they can have open application, which is just the elected side where people are putting themselves forward. So once you've got your shortlists, you've got your people who have put themselves forward for election, or you've done your headhunting to find your appointed board members, they all get screened for their capabilities and their motivations, and then their capabilities can be mapped against the board audit of their capabilities, just to make sure that the people who you're putting forward are the right people for the job, really. And then you can move on to doing your election or your appointment, and I've noted in the model what the advantages of each of these are, and we've talked about those already. Then following the election and the appointment, everybody then undergoes the training, which allows them to develop understanding of the governing role, establish their norms, and this promotes positive relationships. And then these things together as a flowchart process lead to good governance. And then from that, the kind of offshoot is the personal and professional benefits to governors of serving on the board. And you can see that this is a welcome, like it's as a result of them being on the board, this is welcome, but it's not the reason why they should be joining the board.
Yeah, it's always an added bonus, is the personal professional benefit.
Exactly, exactly, the added bonus.
I spend my life training new directors and early stage boards, and that's what we talk about with the new directors, is that their motivation is to serve, primary motivation is to serve and make a difference. But obviously there are some intended personal and professional benefits in that. I'm loving this model. It's actually very similar to the board matrix model that I run. Really interesting how you separated out the elected and appointed, which is something really new, and I think that's a fantastic addition there, especially given that what's really interesting is I'm actually going through this process now with a global board. So a global board that's supposed to be representative of 35 different national NGOs who make up a collection of the same branded NGOs, but obviously as with bigger NGOs, they're individual separate entities in their own countries, and they just have a charter they've signed up to, non-legally binding, but the brand can be taken away from them. Now, obviously, if you're trying to create a representative board at the same time as a skills-based board, because they are governing the entire international community at the same time as a representative. It's a nightmare. You've got 35 countries, even if you split those into regions, and you've got the cultural differences. So, but I like again, because I'm trying to encourage them. They've always had a fully representative board structure, which leads them to have lack of certain skills in the board. And again, all the things you've talked about in terms of strategic oversight is a big thing. Regional issue specific. again, they're torn between their representing of their stakeholder group, their constituency, and again, you can look at political parties for exactly the same thing here, and the greater good, you know, the role I actually play of governance. And again, what I'm trying to advise to them is this hybrid model. But you do start with the gap, the skills gaps or the skills needs, and that's where the audit process. There's one part of the audit process that often gets missed out on this one, which I always bring in, is it actually starts off with the values and the culture of the board first, rather than the technical skills, so more the human skills that you're looking for. And that can be things like, you know, emotional intelligence, you know, or open-mindedness, or, you know, that's something that you're looking for, people who can be pragmatic and not dogmatic, open to, you know, because then you can create this inclusive, diverse environment. I'm loving this model. I'd love to see, again, with the training actually identifies gaps, and there's almost like this circular back to the capability identification. There's just sort of like route back to what do we actually need, or we've actually learned a bit more, what do we need. Fantastic stuff. Carry on.
Yeah, there's definitely potential to kind of make a loop in there, isn't there? Yeah. Well, there was just one further thing to point out about this, and it's like, if you're sitting there now watching this thinking like the hybrid model just isn't going to be right for my school, you can still use this model, because you can see that you can take the route down the left if you're an elected board, or down the right if you're a fully appointed board, and you can see visually here that what the advantages you're missing out on. And then you can take steps to mitigate against them. So, for example, if your board is wholly elected, you could inform your voting community about the capability gaps that you identified. So this will help guide their voting to make it more meaningful. So similarly, if you're fully appointed, you could make the appointment process more transparent by sharing your capability data, for example, to explain why those appointments have been made. So this kind of model does cover if you're fully elected or appointed, just by chance, really, because you can take actions to mitigate against the gaps that you have in your school model. So this is my final slide now. So I was just going to summarize the recommendations that I would make as a result of the research. So firstly, conduct your capability audit and then use the results to underpin your recruitment. After you've done your capability audit, have a nominations or a headhunting and screening process for your prospective board members. Consider using a hybrid structure to capture the advantages of both models, the elected and the appointed. But alternatively, you can take steps to mitigate against the disadvantages of your chosen structure. And then finally, implement a comprehensive training program for governors to develop their understanding of their role and establish protocols.
Leila, that's wonderful. I have two questions I'd like to ask you.
Okay.
My first one is, and I ask them one after the other, so you can answer them straight away, both of them. When it comes to the hybrid structure, do you think it should be a 50-50 split, or should it be, you know, 30-70? Is it like a lot of questions, answers to questions around governance? It depends. So again, when it comes to the hybrid structure, is there an optimal structure? And again, you may not have the data for this, and I'm an old actuary, so I'd be going data crazy if we had the data for this to find the optimal hybrid structure. My second question is about the training. What sort of training would you advise that boards have? Would it be more technical based in terms of the role and responsibilities of the board, so they're going in with their eyes wide open, or at least trained there, or the more sort of the human skills side of things in terms of getting the both best out of the group, or stuff like that? So those two questions.
Yeah. So the first question was about what would be the optimum hybrid structure, and that's a whole other research study, isn't it? So I can't really answer that. I can say that my experience of the case study school, which was roughly 50-50, although the faculty board member was within the elected group. So so there were 5 elected and 1 faculty board member, I think. Oh, I'm confused now. But anyway, the roughly 50-50 anyway, it worked very well. But I haven't looked at other permutations of that to be able to say. So yeah, the answer is I don't know. I do know that the experts talked about limiting board size, so not going too big and not going too small. So it seemed to be kind of the 8 to 12 range tended to be one that they talked positively about. So that's really as much as I can say.
Even that's seen as too big now. They say 6 to 8 is the optimal size.
Oh, really?
Again, it's difficult when you're having a hybrid structure or any sort of representative board, because you've got a lot of different groups to be represented. So again, you get to those bigger numbers and it's very, very hard to manage. Again, it depends on the culture, but I can see how they're saying, you have the right number as well. And that can be tricky. Sorry, yes, you're right. Like, again, interesting with that question. I expected that answer. I was sort of like hoping that you would have something, but I knew you wouldn't in that respect, because it does require a lot of data. And again, I think the thing that I always try and impart on people is that even if you had all the data in the world, the variable is the human. And even if you had all these different structures, within those structures, you have a whole bunch of different individual human beings with their own baggage and skills and, viewpoints and perspectives. And so even if you created this optimal structure, there aren't optimal human beings within that structure. So whatever you do when it comes to a board and its composition, focusing on the fact that it's actually just a group of human beings, a unit in that respect, is the most important thing you can do. They're not robots. So it's actually really hard to construct a perfect board and understanding that unless you really understand people as well.
I think that speaks to your other question about what training is more important. And one of the things one of the board members, an elected board member, said to me was how their annual training helped them get to know each other as individuals and as people, and that made a huge difference to how they then went on to work together through the rest of the year. So I think I would definitely say those kind of soft skills, the human qualities of the board members are really important in terms of the training, and also setting, like you said, the values of the board as well, because in terms of the skills and expertise, you've got the school leaders, you've got the head of the school to be there to provide the educational expertise. What you need to be teaching your board members about is how to interact together within the board framework that your school's established. And that's, setting up those norms and those expectations about how they interact together, and how they deal. Like, for example, at the case study school, they said that the head of school gave like almost a script for board members for if they're approached by somebody from the community with questions about the school or complaints. And it was like, because I think I said, how do you know what to do if someone comes up to you and says, oh, this happened to my child, blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, actually, the head of school has said to us, this is what you need to say to acknowledge their concern and direct them to who they need to go and talk to. And that was a really valuable aspect of their training that was done
to
help them.
Carry on, sorry.
Oh, yeah, just to help them navigate their change in role as well. Because suddenly, if you're a parent that's suddenly elected to the board, you're at dinner parties where people are talking about the school and information that you may or may not be able to share. And I think it's like setting those frameworks and those boundaries to help people with their new role so that they don't feel awkward or get themselves into difficult situations, and that they always know who in the school to direct questions to, whether it's the principals or the head of the school or directing parents back to their child's teacher, for example.
Yeah, and again, as you say, it's these established protocols and processes and having those in the first place. And I think what you're saying there from a training program is it's a hybrid training program as well, between the technical know-how and the non-technical know-how. And I think it's like everything else, the broader you can do it, the better. And the great thing is, if you do have members who are there for at least 3 years, you can actually scaffold the learning. It's not just repeated and new people coming in. So again, the ones coming in for only 3 years, they leave with, you know, great professional development as a potential board directors and other boards as well. So again, hybrid structure of the board composition, hybrid training program to ensure, a more well-rounded, effective governance. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, and that also happened informally as well, that I observed. So in meetings, the chair and the vice chair would kind of gently move the conversation into more appropriate areas if things seem to be talking a little bit too short term or talking about a specific incident that's happening. They would gently guide the conversation into the right direction.
Leila,
that kind of mentoring and modelling was really important too.
Well, that's the thing. Every board meeting is a training exercise in itself as well. Everybody will tell you there, you're always learning something new about yourself and other people. Leila, we have actually run out of time. That has been absolutely fascinating. I love the way you structured that presentation. I can't wait to read the detail, especially the data. I love data. Look, again, thank you so much for your time today and the effort you put into your presentation, and again for the wonderful recommendations that hopefully we'll start seeing more and more hybrid boards out there in international school land.
Great, well, thank you for having me.
Okay, well, bye-bye everybody. This webinar will be available on our YouTube channel, and don't forget, if you haven't already, to join our LinkedIn group. Just search for School Governance Network. Bye for now, Michael, myself, Michael apologises, he's had some technical issues dialing in from China today, but he's been typing in some questions as we go. We hope to catch you for our next webinar. Thanks so much.